A mother walks out of a school meeting and vanishes in the parking lot. Her car sits locked with her purse inside. For 17 years. The custodian who murdered her mopped the floors where her children walked, cleaned the windows her family looked through, and watched the community search for answers he alone possessed. This is the story of how a single piece of torn fabric and genetic genealogy finally exposed a killer who hid behind a mop and a quiet smile. If you believe that DNA can speak louder than 17 years of silence, subscribe now, because this channel proves that evidence waits for justice no matter how long it takes. This is the case of Rachel Thompson, the mother who disappeared from a school parking lot while her killer watched from the shadows. June 12, 2007. Desert Ridge Elementary School in Phoenix, Arizona. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and the faint residue of children's sweat from afternoon PE classes. Outside, the temperature still radiated from the asphalt, even though the sun had dipped below the jagged silhouette of the McDowell Mountains. The Parent-Teacher Association meeting had stretched longer than anyone anticipated. Rachel Thompson sat in the third row of folding chairs, her notebook open on her lap, jotting down details about the upcoming fall fundraiser. At 34 years old, she wore a pale blue cotton blouse and khaki capris, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the kind of approachable energy that made other parents gravitate toward her. She coached her daughter's soccer team, volunteered at the school library, and somehow still managed her full-time position as manager at Summit Sports, a locally owned outdoor gear shop on Tatum Boulevard. When the meeting finally adjourned at 8:15 p.m., Rachel gathered her things with the same efficient movements she brought to everything in her life. She exchanged a few words with Amy Fraser, another parent whose son was in the same fourth-grade class as Rachel's daughter Emma. They talked briefly about organizing a neighborhood barbecue that coming Saturday. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. Amy would later tell police that Rachel seemed completely normal, maybe a little tired, but that was nothing new for a working mother of two in mid-June when school was winding down and summer camps needed organizing. Rachel walked out through the main entrance alongside a small cluster of other parents, their voices echoing off the stucco walls of the school's covered walkway. Security cameras mounted above the double doors captured her in grainy black and white footage, her purse slung over one shoulder, car keys already in her hand. The parking lot was mostly empty by then. Rachel's silver Honda Accord sat under one of the few working street lights, positioned in the second row near the playground fence. She had parked there deliberately, as she always did, choosing spots that felt safe and visible. What happened in the next minutes remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Phoenix history, until DNA finally spoke 17 years later. Rachel never made it home to the quiet subdivision where her husband Stephen and their two children waited. The 4-mile drive along familiar suburban streets should have taken less than 10 minutes. Stephen Thompson called police at 11:30 that night, his voice tight with controlled panic. His wife had been missing for over 3 hours. She was not answering her cell phone. She had not called. This was not like Rachel. Nothing about this was like Rachel. When officers arrived at Desert Ridge Elementary just after midnight, they found Rachel's Honda Accord exactly where she had parked it hours earlier. The doors were locked. Her purse sat on the front passenger seat, visible through the window. Inside, detectives found her wallet containing $73 in cash, her credit cards, her driver's license. Her cell phone was there too, powered off, nestled in the center console cup holder. The keys were not in the ignition, they were never found. The interior of the vehicle showed no signs of disturbance, no indication of struggle, no forensic evidence that would yield meaningful leads for years to come. It was as if Rachel Thompson had simply locked her car in that well-lit parking lot and stepped into a void that swallowed her whole. Detective Marco O'Brien arrived in an unmarked sit-in just before 1 in the morning. At 47 years old, he was a 22-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department with a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. He had graying red hair and the kind of deeply lined face that came from decades of squinting into Arizona sunlight at crime scenes. He walked the perimeter of the parking lot with a flashlight, examining the ground for anything that might tell him what happened. The asphalt was still warm under his shoes. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. O'Brien interviewed the handful of parents who had attended the PTA meeting, most of them groggy and confused when police showed up at their doors after midnight. None of them had seen anything unusual. Rachel had walked out with everyone else. She had seemed fine. One parent, a man named Douglas Hamilton who taught music at the school, mentioned that he thought he saw a white van parked near the edge of the lot when he left. But he could not be sure. Maybe it was beige. Maybe it was not even there. Memory was unreliable, especially when people were tired and not paying attention. O'Brien made a note of it anyway. Every detail mattered, especially in the first 48 hours when cases were most likely to be solved. By dawn on June 13th, search and rescue teams were mobilizing. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras lifted off from the police air support unit, flying grid patterns over the desert areas surrounding the school. Volunteers from the community gathered at the elementary school parking lot, organizing into search parties that would spend the next week combing through brush and arroyos, calling Rachel's name into the vast emptiness. Stephen Thompson stood among them, his face blank with shock, watching as dozens of strangers tried to find his wife in a landscape that seemed designed to hide secrets. Inside the school, the custodial staff continued their work. Among them was Brian Keller, 41 years old, a part-time custodian responsible for maintenance and evening cleaning. He had been interviewed briefly by Detective Phillips on June 19th, stated he was not working the night of June 12th, claimed he was home alone watching television. He seemed nervous, but attributed this to general anxiety about police presence. No follow-up was deemed necessary at the time. Brian Keller continued mopping floors, cleaning windows. He worked quietly, kept to himself, attracted no attention. He knew exactly where Rachel Thompson was, and he said nothing. For 17 years, he said nothing. The Phoenix Police Department mobilized every resource available for a missing mother case. Detective Marco O'Brien coordinated with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office to deploy ground teams across a 5-mile radius from Desert Ridge Elementary School. Bloodhounds brought in from the K-9 unit picked up Rachel's scent in the parking lot but lost it almost immediately, as if she had simply evaporated into the dry air. The desert surrounding Phoenix is harsh and unforgiving. Temperatures in mid-June climb past 110 degrees, turning search efforts into exercises in endurance. Volunteers pushed through acres of desert scrub, their boots crunching on brittle vegetation, their voices hoarse from calling Rachel's name into the emptiness. Helicopters made systematic passes over the undeveloped land north of the school, their thermal imaging cameras searching for heat signatures. They found nothing. By the end of the first week, more than 300 volunteers had participated in search efforts. They had covered hundreds of acres, knocked on doors throughout surrounding neighborhoods, distributed flyers with Rachel's photograph to businesses throughout Northeast Phoenix. Local news ran her story every evening. Her face became familiar to thousands of people who had never met her. Tips began pouring into the police department hotline. Someone claimed to have seen Rachel at a gas station in Scottsdale 3 days after she vanished. Someone else reported a woman matching her description walking along a highway near the California border. Every lead had to be investigated. Every call had to be followed up, even the ones that seemed obviously false. O'Brien and his team worked 18-hour days running down possibilities that led nowhere. The search continued into a second week, then a third. But the initial urgency began to fade as hope diminished. Volunteers returned to their regular lives. The helicopters stopped flying daily missions. The case was not closed, not officially, but the massive coordinated effort had reached its practical limits. Detective O'Brien sat across from Stephen Thompson in an interview room multiple times. Statistics were undeniable. When a married woman disappeared, the husband was always the first person investigators needed to eliminate. Stephen agreed to take a polygraph examination. The results showed no deception. O'Brien believed him. They examined the Thompson family's financial records, looking for signs of trouble. Hidden debts, large withdrawals. They found nothing unusual. Stephen taught American history at Mountain View High School, earned $48,000 a year. Rachel managed Summit Sports, brought home $36,000. They owned their home with a modest mortgage, drove practical vehicles, lived within their means. There were no secret bank accounts, no mysterious credit card charges, no evidence of affairs or hidden lives. O'Brien's team conducted extensive interviews with everyone in Rachel's orbit. Her co-workers at Summit Sports described her as reliable and well-liked. Her boss said she was the best employee he had ever had. Friends from the neighborhood described a woman who baked cookies for school functions, who organized block parties, who seemed genuinely happy with her life. No one could think of anyone who would want to hurt her. Phone records showed Rachel's last call had been to Amy Fraser at 7:45 that evening. A 4-minute conversation while she was driving to the school. After that, her phone went silent. It was powered off sometime between 8:15 and 11:30, though forensic analysis could not determine exactly when. The physical evidence collected was minimal. The car revealed nothing. No fingerprints beyond Rachel's family, no foreign DNA, no indication of what had happened. O'Brien expanded the investigation to include registered sex offenders living within a 10-mile radius of Desert Ridge Elementary. There were 47 of them, each one requiring interview and alibi verification. None provided any investigative traction. 3 weeks into the investigation, a woman named Patricia Wilson came forward. She had been driving past the school around 8:20 on the night of June 12th, heading to the airport for an early morning flight. She remembered seeing a woman who matched Rachel's description near the edge of the parking lot, close to where it bordered undeveloped desert land. The woman had been walking toward a white van, or maybe it was beige. O'Brien felt the familiar tension of a potential breakthrough. But Patricia was 72 years old, well-meaning but uncertain about details. The van might have been a Ford or a Chevrolet. She really could not say. The woman she had seen was wearing light-colored clothing, which matched what Rachel had been wearing, but Patricia admitted she had only glimpsed her for a few seconds. Then came the contradictions. 4 days after Patricia Wilson came forward, O'Brien interviewed Thomas Clark, another parent who had been at the PTA meeting. Thomas said he had held the door open for Rachel as they both exited the building. He remembered this clearly. He said as he was pulling out of the parking lot, he had seen Rachel walking not toward her car, but in the opposite direction, heading south along the sidewalk. She had been alone, moving at a normal pace, not appearing distressed. 2 witnesses, both seemingly credible, offering accounts that could not both be true. O'Brien brought both witnesses back in, asked them to walk through their recollections again. Patricia became less certain with each retelling. Thomas remained confident but could not offer additional information. The investigation was drowning in ambiguity. Every potential lead fragmented into competing versions of events that led nowhere. In August of 2007, 2 months after Rachel's disappearance, a county road maintenance crew found a torn piece of fabric snagged on barbed wire along a dirt access road approximately 3 miles north of Desert Ridge Elementary. The fabric was light blue cotton, consistent with the blouse Rachel had been wearing. The discovery was reported to police. O'Brien personally retrieved the evidence and submitted it to the crime lab for analysis. Basic testing confirmed the presence of blood on the fabric, but DNA analysis was inconclusive. The sample was degraded by sun exposure and contamination. The technology available in 2007 could only determine that the blood was human and female. Nothing more specific. The evidence was catalogued, photographed, and placed in storage. By the end of the first year, O'Brien had compiled a case file 3 inches thick filled with interview transcripts, witness statements, forensic reports, and dead-end leads. The Phoenix media moved on to other stories. The volunteers returned to their lives. Rachel Thompson's face still appeared on flyers taped to telephone poles throughout Northeast Phoenix. But the urgent sense of crisis had faded into resigned sadness. The case went cold. Brian Keller resigned from his custodian position in July of 2007, giving 2 weeks' notice and citing family reasons for his departure. He moved to Henderson, Nevada in August of that year. No one thought to connect his departure to Rachel's disappearance. Stephen Thompson appeared on local news programs every June 12th, a ritual of remembrance that became as predictable as the summer heat. In 2008, he sat on a studio couch with photographs of Rachel spread on the coffee table before him. By 2012, the anniversary segments had grown shorter, reduced from 5 minutes to 2. By 2016, Stephen had to call the stations himself to request coverage, and some years they did not respond at all. Emma Thompson graduated from high school in 2016, a young woman who had learned to introduce herself without mentioning her mother because the resulting conversation was too painful. She studied psychology at Arizona State University, driven by questions she could not answer about loss and absence. Michael, 3 years younger, became quieter as he aged, retreating into video games and online communities where he did not have to explain the empty chair at holiday dinners. Stephen remained in the house on Saguaro Court, unable to bring himself to move. Rachel's clothes still hung in the closet. Her books remained on the shelves. The essential architecture of their shared existence remained intact, a museum of interrupted normality. Detective Marco O'Brien retired from the Phoenix Police Department in 2019 after 34 years of service. His farewell party was held at a barbecue restaurant in Scottsdale. People gave speeches about his dedication, his clearance rate, his mentorship of younger investigators. But later that night, alone in his apartment, he pulled out the thick file he had kept on Rachel Thompson. He had never stopped thinking about her case. Every few months he would review the evidence, reread witness statements, look for patterns he might have missed. The case haunted him in ways that other unsolved investigations did not. The landscape of Phoenix changed dramatically over those silent years. The undeveloped land around Desert Ridge Elementary was sold to housing developers, transformed into subdivisions with names like Desert Vista Estates and Saguaro Springs. The desert terrain where search parties had once combed for Rachel's body disappeared beneath cul-de-sacs and swimming pools. The school itself underwent renovations, adding new classrooms and a modern gymnasium. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children who had not been born when Rachel vanished now walked the same hallways where Emma and Michael Thompson had once been students. Technology evolved. The flip phones of 2007 gave way to smartphones with GPS tracking and sophisticated data analysis. Social media platforms emerged, creating digital footprints that made disappearing far more difficult. The cold case unit of the Phoenix Police Department began using new forensic techniques, including advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy databases that could identify suspects through familial connections. These tools brought resolution to cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. In 2022, Stephen Thompson turned 60 years old. His hair had gone completely gray. His daughter lived in Seattle, working as a counselor for trauma survivors. His son had moved to Portland, employed as a software developer. Stephen remained in Arizona, teaching history at the same high school, known to colleagues as a competent but melancholy figure who kept to himself. He had never remarried. He had never seriously dated anyone after Rachel. Detective Sarah Hoffman joined the Phoenix Police Department's cold case unit in 2021. She was 38 years old, methodical and relentless. In January of 2024, she began a systematic review of unsolved disappearances from the mid-2000s, prioritizing cases where biological evidence had been collected but never fully analyzed. Rachel Thompson's file was among the first she examined. What caught Hoffman's attention was the torn piece of fabric that had been found in August 2007. The fabric with blood on it that had been tested with the limited technology available at the time and deemed inconclusive. Hoffman requested the evidence box from storage and transported it personally to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, where forensic scientists now had access to techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 2007. The lead forensic analyst was Dr. Rebecca Martin, who specialized in genetic genealogy and degraded DNA recovery. She explained that modern extraction methods could retrieve usable genetic material from samples that older techniques would have considered worthless. Dr. Martin worked with the fabric sample for 3 weeks, using specialized chemical processes to extract degraded DNA from the dried blood. The results were fragmentary but sufficient to construct a partial genetic profile. She uploaded this profile to GeneMatch, a public genetic genealogy database that allowed law enforcement queries with proper legal authorization. The system began searching through millions of genetic profiles, looking for matches that indicated familial relationships. Hoffman waited with controlled impatience, continuing to work other cases while her mind kept returning to Rachel Thompson. The results came back on March 4, 2024. The partial DNA profile from the fabric had generated several potential familial matches. Distant cousins and third-degree relatives, whose genetic material suggested connections to whoever had left blood on that piece of blue cotton 17 years earlier. The strongest match was to a woman named Brian Keller, age 73, who had submitted her DNA to an ancestry service in 2019 while researching her family tree. Margaret had 2 children, a daughter named Linda and a son named Brian. Hoffman felt her pulse accelerate as she pulled up database searches. Brian Keller's name appeared in employment records for Desert Ridge Elementary School from 2004 through 2007, listed as a part-time custodian. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Detective Sarah Hoffman stared at the screen, feeling the weight of 17 years pressing down on her shoulders. Brian Keller had been there all along, working at the school. Interviewed briefly in 2007 and dismissed as irrelevant, he had resigned his position weeks after Rachel's disappearance and moved to Nevada. Hoffman pulled up additional records. In 1998, Brian Keller had been arrested in Riverside, California for trespassing and prowling after a woman reported seeing him repeatedly walking past her apartment at night. The charges had been reduced to a misdemeanor. In 2002, he had been accused by a neighbor of harassment after she complained he was watching her through binoculars. That case had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Neither incident had resulted in serious legal consequences, but together they suggested a pattern, a fascination with observing women who did not know they were being watched. Hoffman contacted the Henderson Police Department, requesting assistance in locating Brian Keller's current address. The response came back within hours. Keller was living in a small house on the eastern edge of Henderson, employed as a night janitor at a warehouse distribution center. He had no arrests in Nevada. By all appearances, he was a middle-aged man living a quiet, unremarkable existence. Hoffman contacted retired Detective Marco O'Brien. They met at a coffee shop in Tempe. She explained what she had discovered. O'Brien listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to vindication mixed with regret. He pulled out his worn notebook from 2007 and found his notes. There it was, a brief entry dated June 19, 2007. Brian Keller, custodian, age 41, interviewed by Detective Phillips. Subject stated he was not working the night of June 12, was home alone watching television. Seemed nervous but attributed this to general anxiety about police presence. No follow-up deemed necessary. O'Brien closed the notebook and looked at Hoffman with eyes that had seen too many cases slip away. He told her to be thorough, to build the case properly, because they would only get one chance. Hoffman worked with the forensic team to compare Keller's employment records with the timeline of Rachel's disappearance. She obtained surveillance footage from 2007, grainy and degraded, but showing vehicles entering and leaving the school property. One vehicle captured on June 12 at 8:27 p.m. matched the general description of a van that witnesses had reported. The license plate was unreadable, but the make and model appeared consistent with a 1994 Chevrolet cargo van that Brian Keller had owned at the time. The arrest took place on Tuesday morning, March 19, 2024. Detective Hoffman coordinated with Henderson Police Department and the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. Brian Keller was now 58 years old, his face weathered by decades of Nevada sun. Surveillance teams had been watching him for 3 days. He lived in a cinder block house painted pale yellow, the yard surrounded by a chain-link fence. He had just returned home from his night shift when 6 unmarked vehicles pulled onto his street. Officers in tactical gear emerged with weapons drawn. Brian Keller was ordered to lie face down on the ground in his own driveway, his hands cuffed behind his back while officers cleared his house room by room. Keller was transported to Henderson Police Department for initial processing before being transferred to Arizona. Hoffman observed the interrogation through a one-way mirror. Keller sat with his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed. Keller appeared smaller than Hoffman had expected, a slight man with rounded shoulders and restless hands. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in a voice so soft the recording equipment barely captured it. The lead interrogator placed a photograph of Rachel Thompson on the table. He asked Keller if he recognized her. Keller stared at the photograph for a long moment before nodding. He said he remembered her from the school. He had seen her at PTA meetings and school events. The interrogator asked about the night of June 12, 2007. Keller's attorney advised him to remain silent, but Keller seemed compelled to speak. He said he had been at the school that night, not working, but there to retrieve personal items from his locker. He admitted he had seen Rachel in the parking lot after the PTA meeting ended. He admitted he had spoken to her. The interrogator asked how Rachel's blood ended up on fabric found 3 miles from the school. He asked about the van Keller had owned in 2007, the van he had sold less than a month after Rachel disappeared. Keller's hands moved faster now, touching his face, pulling at his collar. He said it was an accident. He said she had fallen. Rachel had been walking to her car and he had approached her to talk. Just to talk. He had always found her attractive but had never done anything inappropriate. She had reacted negatively, had told him to leave her alone, had tried to walk away. He had grabbed her arm, he admitted that much, just to keep her from leaving. She had pulled away violently, had stumbled, had hit her head. There had been blood. The interrogator pressed him. What happened after she fell? Where did she go? Keller said he panicked. Said he put her in his van because he did not know what else to do. Said he drove north into the desert because he was afraid. Further investigation revealed Keller's sister Linda had been contacted by him the day after Rachel's disappearance. Phone records from 2007 showed multiple calls between them. When confronted with the possibility of being charged as an accessory after the fact, Linda admitted that Brian had called her on June 13, distraught about something terrible that had happened. Linda had driven to Phoenix that afternoon, meeting her brother at a remote location in the desert. She admitted she had helped him clean out his van, had disposed of items Brian said needed to disappear, had provided him with an alibi when police questioned him. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office filed charges against Brian Keller for second-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. Linda Keller was charged with obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. Stephen Thompson received the news from Detective Hoffman during a phone call. He sat down at his desk, unable to process what he had just been told. After 17 years of silence, he finally had answers. Brian Keller's name meant nothing to him. He did not remember ever meeting the man. The randomness of it, the senselessness, was somehow more difficult to accept than any theory he had constructed over the years. The community of Desert Ridge responded with a vigil held on the evening of March 21. Hundreds of people gathered in the parking lot, now called Desert Ridge STEM Academy. They carried candles in paper cups. Stephen stood at the center of the crowd, flanked by Emma, who had flown in from Seattle, and Michael, who had driven down from Portland. What remained unresolved was the location of Rachel's body. Despite hours of interrogation, Brian Keller refused to provide specific information about where he had taken her. Forensic teams analyzed GPS and cell tower data from 2007, attempting to reconstruct his movements. The data pointed toward several remote areas in the Tonto National Forest, northeast of Phoenix. Search teams returned to the desert once again, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Brian Keller's trial was set for October 2024. Stephen Thompson told reporters that he appreciated the efforts but had learned long ago not to invest too much hope in resolution. His wife was gone, and knowing who had taken her did not fundamentally change that reality. What he wanted now, more than anything, was for Rachel to be found and brought home. to finally give her the burial she deserved, to mark her grave with her name and the years of her life that had been cut short by violence she had done nothing to provoke. This is why genetic genealogy changes everything. This is why cold cases never truly die, because DNA waits in silence, preserving truth that human memory cannot hold, ready to speak when technology finally learns to listen. If this case moved you, subscribe to Silent Evidence Reveal. Hit the notification bell, share this story. Help us honor victims like Rachel Thompson, mothers who deserve to come home, whose families waited 17 years for a single word: justice. This was the story of Rachel Thompson, a mother who walked out of a school meeting, and the custodian who watched her family search while he mopped the floors and kept his secret. Remember her name.